I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation, and it is Wednesday, August 24th, 2016, and I am in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. And with me is Dr. Baldwin Sawyer, and my first question for him is to say his name and spell it.
Baldwin Sawyer, BALDWIN SAWYER, and my initials are BS. And in case anybody is wondering, that stands for Boy Scout.
Well, that's interesting. Can you tell us when and where you were born?
July 21st, 1922. I was born, I was born in Narragansett, Rhode Island, in a shore cottage on the edge of the ocean, with a view across the bay toward Newport, Rhode Island. And I wasn't aware of this, but it was a place I loved because I liked being near the ocean. And a little bit north of Narragansett, there was a club called the Dunes Club, and I loved to go up to the Dunes Club, and they had two pools, a saltwater pool and a freshwater pool, and I like to use both of them. The freshwater to rinse off the salt. And so summers I would come to Narragansett, and the winters were in Cleveland Heights, to be exact.
So tell us a little bit about your childhood and where you went to school.
I'm trying to remember exactly.
My
mother had two children, me and my sister Peggy, and at some time after Peggy was born, she traveled, left my father, took both her children to New Haven, where her parents were living, in Irving Fisher's house. And then from there she went for a visit to a psychologist in England. And the only clue I have to that is the British accent was strangely attractive to me in some of the television programs. But that was much later. This psychologist, whom I never met, referred my mother to Carl Jung in Zurich. And thereupon, Mother moved and spent most of the rest of her life working with Carl Jung. I did get to meet him much later and was fascinated to talk with him. He was the grandest, wise old man I ever met in my life. Carl Jung. It was after Peggy was born, so I was either late 5 years old or early 6 years old. I don't know exactly. My first 2 years in school were in Zurich, and the language spoken there was German. And I didn't know much more German than the 1, 2, 3. So I could do arithmetic in the 3rd grade. All the grades were in one room, and this was a place called the Kinderspital, and but I was definitely handicapped in the 1st grade and 2nd grade. And it was a relief to me coming back to the States to return to English.
So then at age 7 or 8, you moved back to the United States?
The really big thing was to be back with my father. I don't know, I guess I felt as though I was a boy who had the privilege of knowing who his father was. And I really felt badly for the many children who never knew their father. And I felt I was lucky to be able to. So it was a very big issue for me to be able to be with my father.
Tell us what your father's and mother's names were.
Oh, my father was Dr. Charles Baldwin Sawyer, and my mother, Carolyn Fisher.
So what did your father do? What was his business?
Oh, he was a student at MIT, and his advisor showed him a periodic table of the elements, and he came to the 2nd element, which is beryllium, and asked, "What is that?" And his advisor said, "That's beryllium. That's this." And what do you? I asked, "What do you know about that?" And he said, "Not very much." And immediately, my father said, "That's what I want to work on for my life." Find out about a new element. So that most of his life was devoted to finding out about beryllium. And he hired a chemist, Swedish chemist, whose name was Bengt Kjellgren. And they worked on beryllium, extracting beryllium from its ore, which is beryl. That's why its name is beryllium. And then they had to find out what it was good for. It turned out there were many special uses. It was very lightweight and strong. And I guess it is not famous with the public, but there are a lot of specialty uses in industry for beryllium and its alloys. So now what's the next thing to talk about?
So he was a curious man and a scientist.
Very definitely, yes.
Yes. So how, in what respects did you follow his footsteps?
It wasn't deliberately. It was just because my interests were very similar to my father's, so that I, just following those interests, led me to follow in his footsteps as much as I could. And
So where did you go for your education for college?
Oh, well, Yale was the main college. And I was accepted at both Yale and MIT. I had good grades, and there was no problem with being accepted. And then my father gave me a hint. He said, well, if you go to Yale, you'll also have more of the humanities than you would if you went to MIT. My father had gone to both. And so I followed his inclination and went to Yale. And it turned out I went to Yale during World War II. So it was, in a way it was cut short. I did have one vacation after my freshman year, but then we had wartime acceleration, so there was no more vacation time. And it was like an endurance race to get through everything, which I did, but I was pretty exhausted when I finished at Yale. And then I immediately started work on the Manhattan Project. And at the end of World War II, suddenly I was free to do what I wanted. And I had a girlfriend by that time. And we discussed it. I said, what I really want to do is to get to work as fast as I can, my graduate studies. And so we waited a year. Well, and I remember an advisor that I had was Frederick Seitz, who soon was head of the American Physical Society. And I said, I want to major in physics. He said, oh, you're going to have a lot more math than what you got as in a metallurgy training. And I'm not sure, but I suspect he thought that would scare me off to have a lot more math. But I said, well, so I'll get it. And I spent a year at the University of Pennsylvania studying partial differential equations and vectors, differential vectors, a lot of higher math. Then I was ready, and by that time Frederick Seitz had become head of the physics department at Carnegie Tech, so I promptly applied to Carnegie Tech and ended up qualifying for my doctor's degree. But as it turned out, I never went to any graduation ceremony. There was always some need for the next place. And it's curious that for high school, for college, and for graduate work, I never went to a graduation ceremony. But I qualified for a doctor's degree.
So that gave you you had a full year, freshman year, and
Yes.
a vacation, but then
Accelerated.
accelerated.
No vacations, yeah.
He graduated from University School in 1940 and then started attending Yale in the fall of 1940.
That's it.
Oh, I see,
Okay.
for 40. And then you finished your undergraduate work in 43?
Yes,
Yeah. So what was your major?
physics.
Physics? And
Always, yeah.
I think,
I was, I was at first part of my studies. I was a metallurgist, and I remember choosing metallurgy because it contained both physics and chemistry, and I couldn't really decide which of those. I wanted them both. So metallurgy was my initial choice for a major, but when push came to shove, I wanted physics more than chemistry, I guess, and so that's what I majored in.
Maybe you can tell us the difference between metallurgy and chemistry.
Metallurgy is probably the oldest scientific study there is. Some of the most ancient writings about metallurgy are how to prepare a splendid sword, like Excalibur was famous. The best swords, of course, had behind them the best metallurgy, and a lot of the swords were hardened by hammering them, and they were given special names like Excalibur. And with a good sword, you could whack through some armor. And so metallurgy has very, very old roots. And before there was a Steel Age, there was a Bronze Age, which was another form of metallurgy, bronze. And in modern years, they made brass, and brass was very useful because it could be machined more easily than bronze. And so a lot of modern machined parts are made of brass. Well, and there's a considerable amount of history, but I think some of the high important considerations I've just touched on.
So what attracted you to that study, metallurgy?
Well, the first attraction was simply I could not choose between chemistry and physics, and I could get them both if I studied metallurgy. So that was really the argument for my entry into it. But I really, my interests were widespread in technology, and so I was covering a lot of territory anytime I was working.
So what happened when you graduated? How did you get to the Manhattan Project?
That was my father's doing, really. I remember when I was free, I interviewed at DuPont and Union Carbide, and then at one point my dad sort of interfered a little bit, and he said, "Here, come on with me, I want you to meet somebody." And it turned out to be John Shipman, who had been his thesis advisor at MIT. And John Shipman learned about what I'd been studying a little and what I was doing. And then he called up somebody who later became my first boss. His name was Frank Foote. And he said, "There's somebody here that you ought to meet." So I met Frank Foote, and right away I had a job on the Manhattan Project. So I was pretty much guided there with gentle tactics, but effective. And,
So where were you assigned? Where did you work?
in Chicago, that's where Frank Foote was. And I remember when I first met him, I said to myself, this man is going to say, this is the right-hand man, my right-hand man. Anything he wants done, I will do. And it worked out that way. I was determined.
That's great. So were you part of what they call the metallurgical laboratory? Or-
Yes. Hmm. That was just a name. It was used quite a bit, but all of this that I knew about was in Chicago, but of course there were connections all across the United States because the parts of the Manhattan Project were in Los Alamos, in Chicago, in New York, and many other locations across the United States. And people did communicate. Oak Ridge was a big one. There were specialties in Oak Ridge. That was sort of an interesting beginning. There were probably 1,000 women in Appalachia who were given assignments, a certain amount of chemicals, and to separate. They would spend an entire morning separating this thing, which was really separating out fissionable material. And they didn't know where or why and what it was going to be done, but they knew that if a certain amount of this isotope was separated, they would get paid for separating it. But that's how the first bomb material was collected. The bomb that burst over Hiroshima was from a lot of parts separated by Appalachian women on consignment, you might say. And so this is how things got done. During the war effort, the policy was a person would be able to know what he needed to know to do his job, and a minimum of more than that. This went for the women, it went for the men, it didn't matter. And I only learned gradually what this thing that I was working on would mean. I knew rather early in the game there would be a lot of energy released when this was finally done, but I didn't know where or why or how. But as time went on, as needed, I learned what I needed to know, and more.
So what did they ask you to do? What were the projects that you worked on?
I guess there were steps. First steps, I needed to separate out what was fissionable and for what kind of fissionable material. And so it was bit by bit, I learned more and more. I never was given a whole sweeping view of the field, but it was pretty much meted out to me bit by bit as I needed to know. And after the war was over, there was a bulletin of the atomic scientists, a publication that we all read and sometimes contributed to sort of spread the information. So a lot of us who were working gradually got to know more and more and got more perspective. But it was all sort of overall was planned in an orderly way. And we got, as I said, we got to learn more and more bit by bit, but never a sweeping, broad perspective. Yeah.
When we talked on the phone, you mentioned the laboratory where you were working, at least at one point. Can you tell us about that? I think you had an address, if I can find my notes. Let's see, 6111 South University Avenue.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was in Chicago. And was sort of cute in a way. We called the place Site B because the floor was a concrete floor, was the bottom of a brewery. So they had Site Site X was in Oak Ridge and Site Y was in Los Alamos. And then our place was Site B because it was located where a brewery used to be. So sort of our own whimsy a little bit. But we were working with I remember sometimes in Chicago there was heavy snow, and I remember once somebody said, "Oh, this piece of I don't know what it was, probably uranium, is not useful," and said, "We don't want it, throw it away," and somebody threw it out the window into a snowbank, and suddenly there was some hydrogen released, and the flame came up out of the snowbank, and it sank down into just a solution. So it was kind of a spectacular scene. So I guess we learned, be careful what you spit out. Don't start any fires that you don't want to have. Right.
So is that part of your work, to study the properties of uranium?
Yes. Well, to work with it and see what you could do. But a lot of the uranium that I worked with was in bars that were 1 inch in diameter and about, I think, 7 inches long, 6 or 7 inches long. And these, when these were working in a pile in a nuclear reactor, they were releasing heat energy, and they needed to be cooled. So the arrangement that we made was that every one of these bars had to be canned in an aluminum can, and with a good thermal bond between the slug in the middle and the can, because it was figured out if we had something that was about 1/8 of an inch in diameter obstructing the flow of heat, this might be enough to melt the uranium and start many reactions with the water that one would not want to have. So it turned out the bond between the uranium and the aluminum had to be pretty perfect to be safe. So there was a whole year spent in developing methods of getting that bond safely. And the final solution was, I remember, we had a molten bath of aluminum silicon, which was a bonding material when it hardened. And we would sink a can held in a heavy container into that molten aluminum silicon so that the can was filled, and then the slug was pushed into the can so that there were no bubbles, which we wanted to avoid. And the whole thing was lifted out and allowed to cool. And then we had a nicely bonded slug that was suitable for putting into the Hanford pile for the nuclear reaction. So Hanford was the first pile that really made the reactions and generated fissionable material that we could use. It was the pace setter for how to do these things. And all this was very secret at the time.
So the canning process was almost the Achilles heel of that reactor out at Hanford, because that was so difficult to get that right.
Well, I never thought of it exactly. I guess I never felt totally defeated, just we had more work to do and more work to do to get it right.
So did you feel an urgency, a pressure to solve the problem? I mean, what kind of mood was there?
Oh, well, a lot of us had a mood that, by God, we knew this was important work and we were going to get it done. and done right, too. So, well, I remember once when some task I was working on took time, and so I worked 2 shifts in a row, right on, straight through the 16 hours without stopping, in order to get that thing done that day. And then I went home and I slept at night soundly. But the mood was not in a panic. It's just we're going to get our job done each day whatever it takes to get it done. And that was that.
So what about your colleagues? You were a very young, newly minted graduate of, what, 20, 21 years old?
Yes. My general mood was be careful, time's a waste, and get that done, the next step. And so I was after myself. Nobody was standing over me with a whip to work hard, but except me.
Do you find that your colleagues had the same kind of dedication and commitment to working quickly? And
I don't know. We joked around a lot. One of my colleagues was Jewish, and we joked quite a bit about Jewishness. He would joke right back, we were bouncing like a ping pong ball between us or something. And it's like whatever differences we had, we accepted and worked with them. And getting on with the main work was the task, not magnifying the differences between us, but minimizing them, I would say. And so I never, I don't know, I never had any trouble getting along with Jewish people.
were there many who were refugees whose families had left Europe in the 30s or even more recently that you knew?
Well, I'm sure there were a number of refugee parents, but I don't know. I think the children of those parents felt if they're born here in America, they're Americans. And they didn't cling on to the past. They were almost go for broke getting their American jobs done.
So do you remember where you lived? Did you live in a house or in Hyde Park, or were you in a dormitory?
Mostly I lived in Mr. Potowski's house. And he was a rather, I don't know if you read some of my stuff, he was a rather strange landlord, I guess it would be. And I had a roommate who was a Wilfred Rahl. He was born of Swiss parents, born near Washington, D.C. His parents were Swiss. And I don't know, we became fast friends. And here's sort of a record about, indicates my feeling about Swiss people. Will Rahl and I shared one bank account. And we saved money by writing, both of us wrote checks against that account. But we never had any problem keeping that line in the middle of what was Will's, what was mine. No problem. And I feel he was one person that his honesty was absolute, and I think mine was too. So we had no problems between us. In Potowski's house, we were both in one room that we rented, and we had double-decker beds. And Mr. Potowski, I think, was of Russian descent, or anyhow Eastern Europe descent. And he was very careful, more or less, to treat us like men, the men he knew. And I remember once my girlfriend called up and said she would be over in about an hour and a half. And he came up and told me, your friend's going to be here in an hour and a half. So he didn't want any present woman to know about this in case there was some problem. There was no problem, but he was protecting me, keeping me out of problems anyhow. So things happened. And sometimes I would entertain, and I know Will and I would give a party, maybe with our two girlfriends along too for the party. And one time there was a half a bottle of wine left over, and I noticed that every day about another inch was gone of that wine in the bottle. And I pointed that out to Will and said, well, he noticed too, and we agreed. And then said, you know, that's pretty fast evaporation, this 1 inch a day. And when the bottle was empty, and I said, you know, shall we try the evaporation rate of vinegar? And so we filled the same bottle half full of vinegar. And then the next day, Mr. Potowski said to me, "What is that?" I said, "Oh, that's their wine bottle." And he said, "That wine, that is too sour." He didn't know how I could stand that wine. But I let him figure it out himself. We never enlightened him. Then across the hall, there was a girl whose name was Jackie Zilbach. And she had been a labor organizer in New York for the Garment Workers Union that had a big problem getting authorized or going. And she once in a while she would start saying "Solidarity Forever," and and you could hear the urge to organize coming out of her. I just sort of said, "Peace. I'm not trying to organize or disorganize. Just I'm not participating." But Jackie was there, and I know it was a strange thing. I guess this is sort of private, but I don't think it hurts to tell anything. Her room was one floor above over mine. And the problem was that the radiator in her room leaked. And she would put a pan, a low pan, such as you could fit underneath the radiator, underneath it. And so the radiator leaking would drip, drip, drip until the fan was full. And then the drips would come right over onto the floor. And pretty soon they were dripping out of our ceiling. And I would hear this drip, drip, drip in the middle of the night and go up, and there wasn't anything. Jackie was asleep, so I would try to empty it. But with the radiator dripping so much, it was terribly cold. And I was in just my pajamas trying to get some peace from the drips. And sometimes I had to wake Jackie up. So in Petoskey's house, you never knew, it was the maintenance was not really up to snuff all the time. The radiators dripped and different things went wrong, but you had to make your best of the situation. Oh, yeah, and across the hall from Jackie, that means one floor up, well, there was a man, and Jackie always called him the man with the guns. He had a whole collection of guns in his room, and Jackie couldn't fail to miss that, and I guess several of us wondered, but I don't think the guns were ever armed. This man had a collection of guns. But sort of a disquieting situation, you might say. But we survived. So I don't... Now this Petoskey's house was near 55th Street, South 55th, from the Loop South, in South Chicago. And where I worked was near South 61st Street. So there was quite a distance that I walked to work. In good weather, I rode my bicycle, and in tougher weather, I walked. So this was just, we lived with the situation we had on our hands and made it work somehow.
So when we spoke on the phone, you said you remembered Enrico Fermi.
Oh, yeah. And his picture was in this thing that you showed me. Mm-hmm. He was the scientist in the Chicago area. I don't know, he was a lovely guy. He was Italian, but he spoke eloquently and clearly. And I thought very highly of him. In the area of physics, one never questions an accent. You live and you communicate as best you can. And he sometimes would lecture to a group of as big as 200 people about some aspect of the program in physics. And he was always very clear in his explanations. And we had few questions to ask. He was so clear. But he was certainly a man I admired a lot. But the other thing I could tell you is, if you have any trouble with handling accents from different languages, don't go into physics. You're going to encounter a lot of them. And there's something just to, life goes on, and you manage as best you can with the accents.
So there were lots of other different accents.
Oh yeah, yeah. Or you never would know when you met a stranger whether you'd have a new accent or not. And
Leo
But the-
Szilard, was he part of this?
yes, Szilard was part of it. And he had more of an accent. Actually, there was a curious thing there. I don't know why exactly it was, but my dad knew some of these people better than I did. I think it was because beryllium was a unique metal that was especially important in physics. And so Dad, being the producer of beryllium, met a wider range of people than I had met, and knew some of them better.
So he continued to work on beryllium at MIT during the war.
No, when he had to choose his thesis project, he chose beryllium. It was not continuing, it was an initial choice. And as he worked, then he learned more and more, and he partnered with Bengt Sjögren for the chemical separations that were needed. And that was before some of that was before my time, but I learned about these things afterwards. But that was a connection he had earlier. And just by my knowing of it, I became a participant in the beryllium business too. But it was not my initial choice. But it is part of the technology that we were all developing.
So do you remember anything else about your experiences at Chicago? Were there many women there? Women scientists?
Well, I met the girl I married there. But she, how was it? She,
Which girl?
uh,
Leona, did you ever meet Leona Woods Marshall, who worked with Fermi?
No. At any rate, I remember one girl applied to work as a nurse during wartime, and the next day I saw her, she said, I had to attend somebody who died last night. And this was an extreme shock to her. I guess nobody had planned this was going to happen, but when people die, it's often 2 a.m. or something, you know, and she was up late with him. And I don't know, for the first overnight that a new nurse is working, to be the one to be present while somebody is dying is quite a shock. But it was wartime, and you don't argue with the situation that you're handed. You just deal with it. And that's what nurses have to learn, I guess. It's not always a picnic. But I was impressed, too. Best I could do was say, I think, sounds like you did a good job. You did what you needed to do. So God bless you. Something like that.
Talking about health, were there any precautions to be sure that people working on these metals and doing experiments with different bonding materials to keep you from harm?
I don't think of any, but if there were precautions, we certainly were educated not to go beyond the boundaries. You don't question the boundaries that were set for us. We were told, just believe there's good reason and don't mess with it. So I'm sure there were some things, but I'm not thinking of anything. Certainly, I can be rebellious sometimes, but about rules like that, I'm not rebellious.
So, how many people do you have the impression were working on the project at the University of Chicago?
Mostly my impression was it was over the entire United States, but the University of Chicago, I could only guess it's a couple of hundred. And I never took a census, you know. It's just the people I encountered.
So
there were both women and men. And I guess the women were more, how should I say, medically educated than the men. A little more of the nursing kind. But my Lord, they were real. They were real people. Every one of us was a real person. We weren't, there's no question about real participation in what we were doing.
Do you remember when you found out about the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima?
I guess, you know, that's an interesting question. I guess I knew matters were coming to a head, sort of something was going to happen. And then I knew it was just about the time that Franklin Roosevelt died and Harry Truman had to take over. And there were advisors who had been advising President Roosevelt about developments in the project, and and they were almost ready to have a bomb ready to use. But Roosevelt died, and Truman was given the advice that had been given to Roosevelt. And he was the actual one who said, yeah, we go ahead.
So you were talking about when you kind of realized that the bomb might be used. And at that point in the spring of '45, were you aware by then that the objective of all your work and the work at the laboratory was to create a bomb, or when did you realize that?
Well, it was somewhere along in there, but what I felt was that there was a developing situation with some tension in it. That we did not want, our nation as a whole did not want to use the bomb. But if the tension continued, and how do I express what the tension was? I don't remember what our enemies were doing, but in other words, if the tension gets high enough, we would have to use the bomb. So I knew there was some kind of developing situation, and it could be used at any time, but I didn't know what would be the trigger, what would be the pièce de résistance, you know. So I knew something was afoot all right, but I didn't know how it would.
Were you aware that there was a petition that Szilard had a large hand in developing to, tell the president that he should think about the moral consequences of being the first to drop a bomb, and that there ought to be a demonstration or some other alternative?
I was not aware of that much. I know there were discussions going on, but it's like there was no one voice that was really taking control. There were a number of arguments expressed, but nothing was directly settled. And it was also was the pressure that expressed the need for to be used increasing. It was, but I didn't know what set the exact breaking point or tension breaking point. But I was aware that these issues were happening. And
so how did you feel when you learned that the bombs were dropped, or the first was dropped anyway? How did you feel about this?
Well, it's sort of like I knew the tension was rising, and so I felt, well, there it's finally reached the breaking point, and the first one. And I was a little surprised that there was a second one too. But I realized the significance of the second one was, hey, we ain't kidding, something like that, in case you need to know. And we also kind of expressed the opinion there more where that's coming from, although it was never released how long it would be before the third bomb was created. It was something like 6 months, I think. But that was definitely secret information. We just wanted that tension to be known, and that we would have more. I guess maybe we wanted it known we weren't bluffing, too. So in that sense, I think we who worked on it were glad when we expressed this thing, we ain't kidding. I mean, we were all behind our leadership. We weren't kidding.
So did you have relatives that were involved in, or would have been involved in the invasion, or know of other people that had
Oh,
family members?
I have written down, I collected 3 different people who all personally thanked me that they did not have to go into war. And one of them was Ray Kelsey, who lives in, I guess he's not living anymore, but lived in Cleveland Heights. He was the closest person. And then there was a man from Japan who was not a particularly willing member of the Japanese army, saying he expressed how relieved he was that he didn't have to fight to the death in defense in Japan. And there was a third man who was in our United States Army, again saying he would have been in the attacking force if it had become necessary to invade Japan. And he was relieved it never became necessary. He probably would have lost his life. So, among these 3, I certainly got the message that this was very meaningful for a lot of people.
So what did you do after the war?
I wanted guess my priority was I wanted to go on with my education to get a doctor's degree. And I indicated a little bit. I learned that in order to get a doctor's degree in physics, I would have to learn a lot more mathematics. So that was the first thing I did, was to go to the University of Pennsylvania for a year and brush up on quite a bit of additional math. Not all of which I ever used, but I guess partly it's just the perspective of understanding how the relationships worked. And so that 1 year at the University of Pennsylvania, and after that, I don't even remember exactly what, but it was working toward getting a doctor's degree. That was my direction. And I and my girlfriend wanted to get married, but she had a year's more work to do for her degree in music. And I had more work to do to learn a year of math. So we agreed to not get married, but she would finish her degree and I would get my math done. And then we would get married. And I remember my dad tried something on me. He was sorry he tried it. I told him I had decided to do a year of math at the University of Pennsylvania. And Dad said to me a little bit severely, well, you know, if you do that, the year of waiting starts after you come back from the University of Pennsylvania. And I stood right up to him and said, I never agreed to anything like that. And then he sort of proudly told me to his advisor, who was a lawyer. Boy, he really told me. You know? And it was quite true. You know, I didn't feel I owed him obedience or anything. I was living my life, and I would keep the agreements I made. I would do, but I wasn't going to have any more restrictions beyond that. And I guess Dad kind of not only respected it, I think he was kind of proud. It means I was now an adult.
But you got your degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
From where?
I qualified for a doctor's degree with Carnegie Tech, but I never got. I guess I got a promise that there would be a certificate mailed, but I don't even have a certificate. So I think I just behaved as though I had a degree, and everybody believed me. And so I went on with my life. And, if I hadn't had no argument about it, nobody else was going to bring up an argument about it. And partly, I guess, it was because I had learned my lessons well and could operate as a mature enough physicist. So, and I guess they felt it. If I felt secure to do what I was doing, that was all right with them. I would do it.
So the first person, or the first organization you worked for after you got your degree was Bell Labs, is that right?
Yes.
And what did you do with them? Or what were you working on?
Well, I guess it was largely, I was defining what I needed to do in their spirit, and so I was outlining my own job, and as long as it was all approved by the Bell Labs, it was almost like I was a surveyor coming into a new territory, and the one I knew who actually did that was George Washington. He surveyed a lot of the land in Ohio, starting in the southeast corner and moving up from there. And so I felt somewhat like a surveyor in deciding what should be done. And it's like my bosses were saying, well, that's fine, son, go right ahead. And if you do something we don't like, we'll let you know. And they were pretty thrilled. And it was new territory in physics. So I didn't bite off more than I could chew. I did some laying out of some of the next steps. And there were no objections.
It's a wonderful situation.
Yeah.
Really empowered to use your
Yes.
curiosity and creativity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In retrospect, the more I think about it, the more that's what I think. Yeah.
So you'd mentioned that they were working on transistors. Is that what you were working on too?
Well, yes. That was really a switch for me. I learned about transistors while I was at Carnegie Tech, and there were new things being discovered almost weekly, and I think what happened was that I knew full well that I always had been the most thrilled to be working on exploratory work. And so when I learned that the area of transistors was largely being how should I say, surveyed and laid out by the first workers. That was exploratory work. I just was sort of thrilled and say, here, what do you want me to do? And I wanted to get involved and do it. And there were people who were delighted that I did. And go on, go right ahead.
You also mentioned something about silicon.
Oh, yes. Well, that was a big transition. The first transistor was made with germanium. And the very first device was simple diode. If you pressed a wire against a piece of germanium and melted it, you could have what was called an NP junction, a negative, positive, two kinds of germanium that would be a rectifier. And then the way the game got interesting was if you put a second wire near that, you could in some ways feed electrons in to make something conductive or withhold the electrons so that it would not be conductive. And such a device with the two wires and one base would be what's called a transistor. And the first ones were with germanium. And somebody said, and I was close to that somebody, silicon has a much lower reverse current. So silicon ought to make an even better rectifier or better transistor if you could make it with more more swing from on to off. So sure enough, they made some silicon and it looked good. And the first silicon device was made in the research department at Bell, and the second one was made in the exploratory research department by me. Starting off what we could do with silicon, which turns out a great deal. And that has evolved and become the big field of electronics.
So that must have been very exciting.
Oh, yes. It was. And, it's almost every time one tried to do something new with silicon, it worked. It worked great, And it was like, well, let's see what more we can do, So an awful, and for most of the public, I guess, it's kind of taken for granted we can do all these things that the new technology can do. But a large amount of that is because silicon does what we want it to do so readily. It's gone way beyond what I can do myself now. But I was in on some of the early victories with silicon. That was certainly a thrill.
Well, then the other major, after you left Bell Lab, the other sort of innovative field you found yourself in was working with quartz.
Oh yes. Well, actually I've spent more of my life working with quartz, but somebody used to pun, what, how about pints, but no, I never drank many pints, in case you wanted to know.
Okay, we're almost done. I would love to have you talk a minute about your work irradiating quartz crystals
Oh,
to make them pure.
it's not exactly right, but I have sometimes irradiated a whole ton of quartz crystals as they came from the ground in Brazil, or mostly Brazil. And quartz is also mined in Angola, which part of Africa, if you put the continents back together the way they were at one time, Angola fits right against where the quartz region of Brazil is. So the quartz that can be found in Angola is kind of directly related to the quartz that came from Brazil. In any case, I tried irradiating quartz with cobalt-60 gamma rays, and that would bring out the colors that could be brought out from impurities. And the most famous color is a lavender purple, which is called amethyst. So quartz with that certain impurity can, if you have an old amethyst that has gotten pale, you can probably irradiate it and bring back the full color again. You take the trouble. So amethyst is one of the colors, and then the more common color is called smoky quartz. That's from aluminum that's in the quartz lattice. And so if you take a whole ton of quartz, it'll turn many colors. You can sort out the smoky colors and know that will probably have more aluminum in it. The amethyst is more rare. And the most rare of all is a piece that does not color at all under radiation. And a friend of mine found a piece of that among a ton that had been irradiated. Said, here's one that has no color at all. And he said that should be important. And so I had it tested, and by that time the Brush Laboratories people had purchased Sawyer Research, and Bob Biggs was the chairman. And it tested to be the purest quartz ever found. And by this radiation technique, we had found something that had virtually no impurities in it, and so this set a record. And later I was able to get a lot of pieces that were very pale and not quite perfect, but very pale. And I was able to get enough to grow one run, which means about 100 pounds in the bottom of an autoclave of high purity quartz. And I sent a piece of that to Bliley Electric Company to test. And I got a call back from John Wolfskill, who works for Bliley, and saying, "Baldy, what have you done?" This had turned out to be the highest purity they'd ever tested, and it was really something. But I was never able to get a whole run of that quality, but it certainly showed what was possible if you found the quartz that won't color. And that's from some years ago now, but yeah, it was exciting, certainly, to verify that it does work, if you can find it.
So looking back, would you say you chose well in being a scientist and pursuing these various...
I have no complaints. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So do you have anything else that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share, either about your Manhattan Project experiences or your life as a scientist afterwards, or?
Well, I guess I'm resigned to accept that some of my best friends have died, my wife, and I know our lives all come to an end. We don't live, none of us lives forever. But, so if I could be granted a wish, I would wish that some of the people who are gone were still able to see what's been possible to be accomplished and so on. I know it's not possible.
Yeah.
And that adds up to, I love to share the joy and the excitement of some of the things that have happened. I guess the first girl I really fell for was a musician, and eventually I married her. So it's really Dorothy, my wife, that has introduced me to music. And the more I learned, the more I loved it. So that's, it is strange, and in my case, I've kind of mixed up music and love together because of the circumstances. And so I feel it, and I don't always express it very well, but it's all there.